Frederick Forsyth, The Day of the Jackal. What a book. Full of suspense, full of tension, very, very exciting. There were times when I was reading this book, I like to read on the tube. I like to read on the underground. And there were times when I was reading this book and I was so excited to turn the page. But then I thought, no, this is so good. I want to save it till later. Can you imagine? And that's why it took me longer than usual to finish reading this book. Not because I was reading particularly slowly, but because I didn't want it to end. I didn't want it to finish. And I was trying to save. There were moments when I was like, I'm going to save this part. It's going to be so exciting. I want to save it till later. That's how great the book is. That's how exciting it is. That's how brilliant it is. It is really, really so well written. Quick summary of the plot. Spoilers ahead. The OAS, a group in France, they don't like President Charles de Gaulle. The book is set in the 60s, during the time of President Charles de Gaulle in France. This group called the OAS, they don't like Charles de Gaulle because Charles de Gaulle has given independence to Algeria. But the OAS, they want Algeria to remain a French colony. So they want to get rid of President Charles de Gaulle and become leaders of France themselves, and then restore France as colonial masters of Algeria. That's their plan. But they need to assassinate President Charles de Gaulle first. And they can't get the job done themselves. For whatever reason, whether it's, whenever they try it, they have some bad luck, some bad timing, or they can't shoot straight, or somebody in their organization gets bribed or gets tortured and gives away information. So for whatever reason, they can't carry out the plan. So they hire this assassin called the Jackal. And the assassin is foreign, he's English. And they offer to pay him a lot of money that he can retire on, because the Jackal says to them, if you assassinate President Charles de Gaulle, you can't work again as an assassin. It has to be retirement money so that I can live well for the rest of my life. So they agree. The Jackal starts to put his plan into action. And this is when the story really, the writing of Frederick Forsyth really comes into its own, because in detail, he explains in detail how the Jackal goes about his work, his day-to-day preparation, assuming false identities, getting hold of false passports, false identity papers, getting hold of the weapon he's going to use, how he travels around Europe, not just by plane, but also by hiring cars and driving across borders and knowing all the side roads and the small villages, how to travel from Italy to France, to Belgium, to meet all these different people to get his false identity papers, to put his plan into action. And then eventually, his final mission is going to be in France to try to assassinate President Charles de Gaulle. And what Frederick Forsyth does very well is he juxtaposes the character of the Jackal, who is dashing, exciting, handsome, elegant, well-dressed, eats well, meets interesting women, glamorous women, elegant women, he juxtaposes that with another character called Commissaire Claude Lebel, who's the French detective, who's tasked with foiling the plan of the Jackal. And by the way, there are no spoilers here because, historically, as a matter of historical fact, everybody knows that President Charles de Gaulle was never assassinated. So you already know before you pick up the book how the story is going to end. You know the Jackal is going to fail because it's a matter of historical fact. So it's not really a spoiler to tell you how it's going to end. But even though you know how it's going to end, and even though you know the Jackal is going to fail, the journey to get there is so interesting. So what Frederick Forsyth does is he juxtaposes this character of Commissaire Claude Lebel with the character of the Jackal. And Commissaire Claude Lebel, is described as boring, grey, mundane. But by being boring and mundane and just going about his work in a boring, systematic, methodical way, he eventually, step by step, gets closer to the Jackal and gets closer to foiling his plot. And it's very interesting to see the juxtaposition of the two characters. And one of the most interesting parts for me was when the Jackal becomes aware, he's made aware through a contact at the OAS, that the French authorities are onto him, that they know there's somebody called, there's an assassin, and they know that the assassin's code name is the Jackal, and they know that his plan is most likely to try to assassinate President Charles de Gaulle. And once the Jackal becomes aware of that, he has this moment with himself where he thinks, should I turn back or should I continue? And he kind of weighs up the pros and cons, and he says, well, maybe they know there's an assassin, and maybe they know the assassin's code name the Jackal, but they don't necessarily know what the Jackal looks like. And he thinks to himself that he's already a couple of steps ahead of the authorities, and he can stay a couple of steps ahead of them. You know, he's got different disguises and different identities that he can assume going forward. But then on the other hand, he thinks to himself, well, the authorities are pretty clever too. In the end, they'll probably will find out what I look like. They will catch on. So maybe he thinks to himself, maybe he should turn back. But then what convinces him to carry on is that, and this bit is so well written, this part of the book is so well written by Frederick Forsyth. He describes how the Jackal, you know, remembers sort of like a tough childhood, and then remembers that since becoming a well-paid assassin, he's been able to live very well. You know, so since becoming an assassin and since becoming a well-paid assassin, he's able to wear fancy suits, you know, tailored suits. He's able to eat at top restaurants, stay in top hotels, to meet glamorous women, elegant women. And the Jackal does not want to give up that lifestyle. And because the Jackal wants the money and doesn't want to give up that lifestyle, he decides to continue and take the risk. And of course, he's doomed to failure. So that's very interesting part of the book. I highly recommend you read the book. You won't be disappointed. The book was written, even though the plot is about the 60s, the book was written in the early 70s, published in the early 70s. Immediately afterwards, I think there was also in the early 70s, there's a very famous movie adaptation starring Edward Fox as the Jackal. It's one of the best movies you're likely to see. Really, really authentic and true to the book. I highly recommend you read the book. Highly recommend you watch the movie. Recently, there was a TV adaptation, completely different storyline, of course, not about Charles de Gaulle. And one more thing, this edition of the book has a foreword by Lee Child, who's the author of the Jack Reacher books. And Lee Child mentions in the foreword something that everybody will experience when they read the book, is that at various points, you find yourself rooting for the villain, rooting for the bad guy, rooting for the Jackal. It's really weird. But it's a testament to how well Forsyth has written the book. And has Forsyth done this deliberately? Who knows? But despite yourself, at various points, you will find yourself rooting for the villain or rooting for the bad guy, which is not usual in stories. But in this story, it just happens to be that way. And what people have said is, not just when they read the book, but also when they see the movie version with Edward Fox. And even people who've seen the recent TV adaptation have said the same thing, is that they find themselves rooting for the villain. So from that point of view, perhaps it's a unique story. But either way, highly recommend you read this book. Highly recommend you watch the movie version starring Edward Fox. You won't be disappointed. See you guys on the next one.